Hello, and welcome to Lore Watch, a roundtable freeform discussion about lore and your favorite media. I'm your host, Joe Prez, one of several lore-focused folks from Blizzard Watch, and I've got my, normal, marvelous co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How you doing today, Matt?
Marvelous.
The enthusiasm is just
I'm actually the second post-credit scene.
And then joining us today is a friend that you may have noticed from our last week's live show or recording for the regular show, Eric. Eric, say hi to everybody.
Hey, I am thrilled to be here on Lore Watch with you guys. I've been listening a long time, and it's kind of cool and surreal to be here talking with you.
Yeah, Eric, turns out, has been doing a lot of tinfoil hatting and a lot of lore writing for the website, and had mentioned that he was interested in potentially coming on the show, so I figured, what's a better time than now? And with that said, if you friends at home, we have a theme that we're going to be going for the next 2 episodes here. If you have an idea for a theme or questions you want answered, be sure to send those in to us at podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for, and if it's a theme, obviously we have an idea of where it's for, as well as any special pronunciation for your name. If you want to hit us up on Discord, we have the Q and Podcast Questions channel, which is open to everybody. Same rules apply. And if you are a Patreon supporter, you can go ahead and hit us up on the Patreon Q and Podcast Questions channel, where we tend to look there first for any questions or themes. And you can also send us messages on Patreon, and we will make Liz do work. But this episode was actually spawned by a question we received from somebody by the name of Red Bandit 1213. Hello, all. Troll Hunter of Skywall here. Question for Lore Watch. Why are kobolds so vastly different in media? Warcraft has them as rodents, D&D is mini dragons, and after watching Delicious in Dragon recently, they had a kobold that looked like a husky. And this spawned a conversation topic of, there's a lot of different representations of different races in fantasy, like what we consider staples, in all forms of media and in real life folklore. And I figure we'll start with kobolds, which Matt will probably go into professor mode here in a second, but I'm going to do my best to kind of give a quick overview. But I remember kobolds as originally being a name for a household spirit in Germanic folklore. And it was sort of a catch-all term for all manner of beings that were essentially small and mischievous. There are different versions of them that I remember from it, but they were always small little humanoids, maybe akin to almost like goblins, kind of, but goblins were their own thing. I think that's correct.
I mean, it's more or less correct. Basically, if you ever heard of like any Grimm fairy tale where there's somebody in the house who makes the shoes when the guy can't make the shoes, that's a kobold. They're effectively like genus loci type spirits. The thing about kobolds, and the thing about, I think, talking about the subject, because we're going to talk about it with a bunch of different things, there's 3 main reasons this happens. The first is, for lack of a better word, folkloric expansion. As somebody somebody has a story about weird little critters that live in his basement and help him make shoes. He tells that story to somebody else, who tells that story to somebody else. The story changes as it's told, and effectively through what is kind of a process of translation/adaptation, you get more and more different kinds of kobolds, because this guy's now telling a story about guys who live under a hill and who are mining all the gold, and if you go in there, they'll kill you. Whereas this guy's still telling the story about the shoemakers, and this guy's telling a story about little people who live out in the fens and, don't want you to steal their Lucky Charms. That's one of the things that causes this kind of change. The second is what I like to call, I'm going to put my spin on it. And that's just straight up, somebody takes the word kobold, goes, okay, cool. I don't care what the mythologic aspects of this were. I'm going to say they're dog people, or I'm going to say they're lizard hybrid people, or I'm going to say they're just weird rat people. And that's how you get there. And the third way is something I call literal translation drift, which is similar to but distinct from the folkloric one, because the word kobold is actually the root. The Germanic word kobold is cobalt. as in the element cobalt. They named the element after the spirits. And as a result, a lot of stories of kobolds, as they were kobolds, changed into like more like dwarves and other under the hill gnome types. And in this way, you get all the different variations that we now see. Practically every version you mentioned in your question, Red Bandit, those are all I'm going to put my spin on it changes. That's literally people who'd only ever heard of these things from D&D anyway, and in D&D they were kind of like lizard dog people. Originally they were kind of lizard/dog people in D&D. And so when you see kobolds that look like dogs, that's somebody taking the dog half from D&D and running with it. The ones in WoW are basically that, except they made them less like dogs and more like kind of like covetous rats. I don't know why they did that, but that's definitely a choice that they made.
The first edition Monster Manual kobolds are fascinating because you can see where it comes from both and it's split off. That illustration has like dragon horns and elfy ears and scales and a dog snout. It's like it's fascinating to see exactly where the branches happened because you could go either way.
Yeah. You got to remember with a lot of this stuff that we're going to be talking about, a lot of it does go back to the Monster Manual.
Real quick, I would also like to point out it actually comes before that too, because before the Monster Manual, well, you can see that if you ever pick up Chainmail, which is basically the fantasy supplement that Gary Gygax made in 1971, which you can tell it was very much inspired by The Hobbit. You also have the kobolds show up there, where they're an offshoot of essentially goblinoids, and they share a lot of the same features, with slightly more intelligent. And I remember them riding giant badgers because that was a thing. They just rode badgers into battle.
But think of mine too. Like a lot of these things get changed and brought because these people were desperate for new monsters. And as a result, you basically had people running through folklore books. I remember the first time I heard of a Penhaligon, which is a kind of vampire spirit that leaves its body behind and takes its head, neck, and intestines out to drink people's blood. That's from like Malaysia and the Middle East, Asiatic islands, Australasia, I think it's called. Yeah, Australasia. That's from those areas, and there's a bunch of different versions of it. I first came across it in a freaking Monster Manual. The Questing Beast, the Periton, which is like a big deal if you've read like various the Atlantis books and so forth. I first came across it in the Monster Manual because they were desperate for monsters. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of stuff coming from that.
And you also have the animators who have some reference material to go on. So if all that first edition Monster Manual illustrator has to go on is the description from Chainmail, and it says, their voices sound a little bit like dogs barking, then they might
draw them looking like a dog.
Well, I'll put a dog snout on it, and then it iterates from there. So it's sometimes it's a conscious decision, sometimes it's just one person making one decision that causes that split. It's fascinating.
It's got to look like something, and we've already got goblins in this, so I can't make them look too much like goblins, or otherwise people will not be able to differentiate them. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways it comes across, but kobolds is a good example because it gets wild how varied they can get from game to game from that original Germanic root. Whereas elves almost always have something that goes back to Tolkien. Like almost, if you've got elves in your game, they almost always don't go to Norse myth. They don't go to like Celtic/Gaelic stuff. They usually go straight to Tolkien.
Which is funny when you start considering, and we can probably do a whole thing about elves here, and maybe we segue into that. But then you start considering not just how everything in popular culture is really harkening back to the Tolkien, but then you start looking deeper at it and how many other representation of elves there's been just culturally, right? Like going to Norse mythology, and this is one of the things that I thought was really fascinating to me, is I had a friend who never really knew anything about elves aside from what they had seen in like Lord of the Rings and D&D. And so they thought that's just what elves were. And then they played God of War, and they played God of War for the PS4, and they got to see Alfar, and they got to see how, like, and again, the game wasn't 100% accurate to Norse mythology, but it was pretty close, with some liberties as far as like what Norse considered elves to be, because there what is it? There are two in Alfheim. Alfar. There is two distinct flavors of them, light and dark elves. So if you ever see light and dark elves in any of your games, or even in some of your D&D supplements, you can thank the Norse for that, because that came way first.
Yeah, but the other problem is that I'll let you go, but there's
go ahead.
Thing to mention.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that they sort of hinted at but didn't do in God of War, because they ended up having their own kinds of own kinds of dark elves in at least the Norse myths, as in books like Sturluson's books, or the Havamal, or what have you. There are light elves and dark elves. The light elves are the Vanir, and the Isa-Efa, the high elves is another word for them. So there's like high elves and light elves, but then the dark elves are the dwarves. Like what you call an elf, like what they call dark elf, they literally meant dwarves. Like the guy who makes Thor's hammer, Brock and Etri, in the myths, not just in the game, Brock and Etri are called dark elves, Daveva. And I can't pronounce the words crap, but I'm sorry for anybody who's from actually a Nordic country going, oh my God. But that root is the root of Tolkien's dwarf elf rivalry. The reason he has that in there is because in Norse myth, the dark and light elves, they weren't called that because one was good and one was evil. They were called that because one lived out in the sun, in the forests, and the other mined. They were digging in the ground. Of course, everything's dark. They don't see anything. It's so there's elements of it that just get changed by the sheer passage of time, the adaptation of it, which is fun because if you then go to, like, say, Celtic mythology, the elves still kind of exist, except they're more commonly known as she. Like Beoan she means, it's the word that became banshee in folklore. It doesn't mean ghost that screams at people. It means a kind of higher alien intelligence, similar to the word Alfar, which is what the Norse used for it. If you look at the stories of like the sons of Mil versus the Tuatha De Danann, that's a lot of what we draw elvish culture from in our when we use them. More so even than Tolkien, we just don't know that we're doing it in a lot of cases. And it is, elves are fascinating because you can look at like how some places just make them, they got pointy ears, they live a long time, and that's it. And not really that different otherwise. Whereas otherwise you get to like the point where I feel like Michael Moorcock's Melnibonéans are elves. They're just really alien elves. And it's an interesting way to move from that concept, where it's very similar to the Tuatha De Danann, where you've got the, I'm not going to be able to say his name, and it's going to drive me out of my mind. Nuada of the Silver Hand, who literally loses his hand and thus can't be king of his people, because the maimed man couldn't be king because the king and the land are one. If the king has a wound, he can't be king because the land will now have a wound, so they have to get a new king. And in order to get around that, they go and get Nuada a silver hand. Like the weaponsmith, the Anshecht, makes him a silver hand. All of this is stuff that you see over and over again in elvish stuff. To the point where I think the Hellboy movie is a really good example of this, where when they depicted Nuada, he's basically just an elf. Like they didn't do any of the Nodin stuff. They didn't tie him into the gods or King Lud who smashed machines. But that's all there. And it's kind of another reason why you have elves who are constantly hostile to anything but magic, because that aspect of them has carried forward. And elves are really so different almost everywhere. I think every time Dungeons and Dragons has done a new world, they've done something really weird with elves.
I was going to say elves have so many flavors. I mean, look how many different kinds of elves we have in World of Warcraft. I can barely keep track of them, and they keep adding new ones. So it seems like almost a feature of elves that they can split up. I mean, maybe it's because they're so long lived, and some of them say, we're going to go live over here, and then when they run into each other again 1,000 years later, it's like, oh wow, your ears are much longer than mine and pointier, and your skin's green now. But there always seems like, no matter what kind of media it is, there's not just elves. There's always forest elves and high elves and dark elves.
Yeah, and that does to a certain degree go back to Tolkien again, because he does that with the men of Numenor and the elves that they descend from. They have originally the one kind of elf, and then they split into factions. I remember the one that Galadriel's elves are a different kind than the one I'm going to forget his name, but Hugo Weaving played him in the movie.
Elrond.
Yeah, or his people are a different kind of elf. He's actually the half brother of the human who became king of Numenor, because they both chose. One chose to be an elf, the other chose to be human. Effectively, one chose to be mortal and one chose not to be. So he's actually related to Strider. Like that, he's not just taking him in out of the goodness of his heart. The kid's like his nephew 20 generations removed. So it is interesting to see how these little weird things come up. I do like the fact that almost every, like Dark Sun elves. Joe. Joe talk about them.
Yeah, so Dark Sun elves are interesting, right? So they're they're depicted in Dark Sun, which is, a lot of people either love or take it. It's probably my favorite D&D setting, just for various reasons, which we'll talk about another time. But they're a nomadic race of herders, raiders, peddlers, and thieves, is the best way to really describe them. But they're pale and they're thin and they're very like almost like barely humanoid in the fact that like they're more skeletal in nature as far as like how they look. And each tribe of them, each grouping of them is ridiculously different culturally. This is also one of the few descriptions that depicts them as tall as they are. In this version, an average elf stands between 6.5 and 8 feet tall. And that is the only time in D&D that we see an elf depicted this like tall, and combined with their slender builds, they are incredibly alien as far as like their appearance to the other races. Their skin is weathered because they live in the desert and there are nomads. So they have almost like this leathery like aspect to them. They don't really tend to have major cities. They just like find different places to settle down. And because of this, you don't have like the same beautiful interpretation of elves that you do in other media. So they're not these like courtly, stately figures that are prim and proper and wield magic as if it was an art form. No, these are hardy, nomadic warriors that are vicious as they are hardy. They are a deadly force. A single elf warrior noted that it could cross better than 50 miles a day through the desert. They're made for a different type of just environment. They don't use beasts of burden for personal transportation. They're all about this like sort of self-reliance, and they're also referred to as savage. They tend to be more warlike. They will barter, but they don't really care about dealing with other races as much. And I remember it just being a very extraordinarily unique interpretation of what an elf would be, until I started going deeper into some of the other bits of like real world lore, like going back to some of the Norse interpretations. While Matt, pointed out that the light and dark are basically the ones that live in the sun and the ones that live in the ground, there's also interpretations that, whether they're accurate or not, that they were almost hive-like, that they were almost insectoid in sort of like their collective like reasoning and their collective like community, where yes, they were extremely magical beings, but they all sprung from the same font. They all sprung from the same great ancestor. And as a result, we're all one people, all sort of unified and of one mind. And like that is also another really fascinating possible idea for them, because you don't generally think of that with elves, right? Most people, if you tell them to name an elf, they're going to name like Legolas, or they're going to name Drizzt Do'Urden, or they're going to name some other major pop culture one. And a lot of them are not going to know that like these other variations of them exist. It's absolutely fascinating.
People often like go see Shakespeare's plays, and they never really understand that the Oberon and Titania from those plays are essentially the lords of the fairy.
Mm-hmm.
And the fairy are intended to be and are where the elves come from. It's from the same root word. The Elfan, but the word fairy comes from that as well. Partially because Norse people invaded Celtic countries, and so their different conceptions of weird alien fey creatures sort of merged together. And since the Romans traveled throughout the length of Europe, the stuff they thought got mixed in. And a lot of that works for, like we already mentioned to a degree, where dwarves come from. Dwarves are unique in that they are very much a Norse interpolation.
Mm-hmm.
They come from the Norse. And what we see of them is either almost straight out of Norse myth, or it's straight out of Tolkien's version of Norse myth. That's pretty much everything you see about dwarves. It's either what Tolkien said about Gimli, or it's in some Edda somewhere. Like the whole deal where they can cut off Loki's head, but they can't touch his neck. So they just sew his mouth shut. That's brockenetry. That's an original dwarf thing. That's if you want to know how dwarves think, that's it.
Yeah, like elves and dwarves are the big example of how Tolkien is kind of like this giant filter of, before that there's, elves and dwarves in various mythologies, but the things that he picked moved forward, and so many people after that, were inspired to create D&D and so many other media using that thread from Tolkien's interpretation. And all these other things that exist outside of it are kind of bleeding back in now, because it's easier to look up what the myths might be from, like, the Polynesian islands or other places in the world that, Tolkien didn't include because he maybe didn't even have access to it. And now that we have the internet, there's all these ways that you can go out and get this mythology from around the world and plug it into your game. So when you think of, elves as what Tolkien decided they were, like, yeah, they kind of like what our modern idea came from him, but there, he was pulling from something else. He was always pulling from something else, and what he was pulling from was what he had available to him.
Yeah, so many cultures have that kind of slightly alien outsider being who is like a spirit of the woodlands. That very many cultures have different versions, like the Aeshu from Northern Africa, that all end up feeling like elves to us, because there's a niche for that in the mythologies of various countries. As people encountered certain situations, they came up with myths for them. And one of those myths is the strange, confusing, appalling, somewhat alien, fey folk type beings. And there's so many different games out too. I mean, like I was just thinking of Changeling, the one from White Wolf,
mm-hmm.
and thinking about Changeling led me to Exalted, which definitely has pretty crazy ideas on this kind of thing. And there's just so many. And then you get to video games where, think about like Morrowind or even Oblivion, but Morrowind really, when they have the Dunmer and they have the Altmere, and they are different in terms of their coloration, but they're also just different. And what's really funny is there's the third group, which again are essentially dwarves. What are the ones that have the mechanical ones? I can't remember. They're all gone, but we find their ruins.
Yeah, the dwarves, what's the name for the...
Something Mer. I know it's something Mer because I know that they're effectively...
Dunmer? No, the Dunmer are the Dark Elves.
Dunmer are the Dark Elves, yeah. I can't remember, but I was just playing Oblivion too, and that's probably why I can't remember it. But there's the way that the Elder Scroll does it. The Elder Scrolls, like Kingdoms of Amalur, very deliberately doesn't have dwarves in it,
mm-hmm.
but it has the stuff dwarves did in it.
The Dwemer, yeah.
Yeah.
You go through their ruins. You go through you get their artifacts and their weapons and stuff. But yeah, there's elves.
They're all
and
gone.
The dwarves are gone.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about it. I think that you find out magic thing happened and literally they all vanished. But it's just interesting to me that like one of the biggest fantasy franchises out there has just gotten rid of dwarves. Whereas D&D is like, D&D ones and, World of Warcraft was like, oh, hell no. We're not losing our excuse to have Scottish people yell around.
I'd like to solve it eventually. I'd like to have Elder Scrolls 6 give us actually find out what happens to the dwarves.
But that's we're so far we're talking about dwarves, elves. We talked about kobolds briefly. Should we finally move on to the ones where Tolkien has the most and yet least influence and talk about orcs?
Yeah, you know what? Go for it. I think that's not a bad transition.
Okay, orcs. On one level, orcs are almost entirely an invention of Tolkien. The word comes from the Latin word orca, which is also sometimes used as orcus. And you see it before Tolkien. You see it in the poetry of William Blake, where he has a character named Orc who is a violent rebel against all things because he wants freedom, and he wants freedom from concepts. He wants freedom from the shackles of morality. He wants freedom from everything. He's essentially like a spirit of America in Blake's America the Prophecy. And in a weird sort of way, if you want to get a good idea of a semi-modern correlate to Blake so you can understand his writing, Jack Kirby with his New Gods is very similar to what Blake was doing. All of like characters like Rintrah and Orc are part of Blake's mythology of New Gods. And so it's useful to look at Orc because the word comes from, for one example is the Latin orcanus.
Well, does that mean like underworld or evil, something like that?
Or killer.
Yeah.
Orcanus, the animal orca, Orcanus orca, it's called a whale killer, not a killer whale. We often call them killer whales nowadays, but the name literally means whale killer. It kills whales. Now, is it a whale? Yes, but it kills whales. That's what it does. So the concept of the word orc, that's where it comes from initially. And we know Tolkien knew this. Tolkien was a linguistic genius.
Yeah, he was a linguist.
He was not just a linguist. He was one of the finest, best philologists of his generation, and possibly one of the best ever to live. I would argue that Tolkien as a writer of fiction is okay, but as a study of languages, he may be Earth's premier genius.
He just wanted to write a story so that he could put his own language into it.
Yeah, and
that's how he ended up with The Hobbit.
Yeah, his languages were actually so elaborate that it's not like when you had Klingon and a bunch of people had to come along to explain, oh, wait, we need a word for this.
No,
that's what happened with Klingon.
He laid it all out directly.
Yeah, Tolkien did the whole thing himself. And he borrowed from such interesting concepts. But to get back to the orc thing, the word orc isn't used that often in Tolkien. He talks about them in a general sense, but when you see them, he has various names for them, like Uruk-hai. And that means essentially high orc. It's not just, your rabble. The rabble you see in The Lord of the Rings are more akin to goblins than they are to what we think of when we hear the word orc. When we hear the word orc, we're thinking of Uruk-hai.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
These big, massive, terrifying forces of nature. But all of that's a Tolkien idea, but it's not like he just invented it, because we've had concepts for things like boogeymen and bugbears and hobgoblins and goblins and red caps. If you ever heard of a red cap, it's kind of like the opposite of a good time. It's a fairy story where you run into this fairy creature wearing a red hat, and the red hat is just a wool hat that's completely soaked through in blood because the thing is a murder machine. And all these different things existed before Tolkien. And he's sort of like, if you look at Norse mythology, one of the things you've got there is, which actually even comes up in Skyrim, those weird dead bone people, the Draugrs. That's something that's been in Norse mythology for a long time. Mm-hmm. There's the idea of going to like faraway lands and there's just monsters waiting to fight you. The giants from, the Jotun, from Norse mythology, they're all basically portrayed like that as well. And Greece had it. The ancient Romans had it to the point where they had words for it. Again, like orc, it comes from Latin, and it is just fascinating to me how the concept of goblins, as we have it now, is refined through Dungeons and Dragons more than it's refined through Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
In Tolkien, goblin is just another word for the lesser orcs. It's just, okay, you can be one of those creatures, or you can be one of the big powerful ones. And in Tolkien, orcs are elves who made a bad deal with the guy who was Sauron's boss, Morgoth, I think.
Well,
Morgoth,
yeah, kind of. It was gonna. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
No, if Eric's going to go.
They were originally elves that were like tortured in the dungeons of Morgoth, right?
Well, so that's the thing with Tolkien, right? And this is one of those weird things. It's inconsistent because if you go to the early works, it depicts them as being pure creations of Morgoth, made to mimic the forms of the children of the Iluvatar. And then in the Silmarillion, they go back and they mention that they might have been the East Elves that were then tortured and bred by Morgoth. And then there's other references to the Avari, the elves who refused to go to Aman and then naturally turned savage and wild. So all of these are references that are made inside of Tolkien's work, but there is no definitive origin, or all of them could also be valid. And that's the problem.
I honestly think my thing with Tolkien is I think he does this because he's not writing any of these from the perspective of he's not writing them like this is true. He's writing them like this is a book that you will find if you go to Middle Earth and it says this. He's like Herodotus was with actual mythology, except he's making up his mythology too. But everything you hear, like when you originally hear about them, you're hearing about it from this guy's perspective because he wrote a book. Now you're listening to this person talk. This person is telling you his perspective. And that's something you find so much in Tolkien that it becomes, the Silmarillion becomes almost impossible to read because it is almost Joycean in its like references and allusions that you probably don't know. Like you've not read the original, Havamal in the original Norse, have you? He did. So he knows when he names it Iluvatar. Was it how I can never say the name? The high god, the one that is the music of the spirits type guy. When he made them, that's a later introduction. He's not even in the initial story because most people aren't even supposed to know he exists. And that's the thing about Tolkien. Tolkien knows this stuff. He's making references to the original works, but he's also hiding them within the story. Orcs are fascinating that way because on the basis of them, they're just big dumb monsters. But if you go into the mythology of them, the mythology he invented, there's a tragicness to them, much like the Witch King of Angmor.
Mm-hmm.
The Witch King is cursed by himself, ultimately. It was his own choices. So if that story about the elves being tortured is true, it's one kind of tragedy. If it's just what happened because they refused to do what they were ordered to do, then it's another kind of tragedy. But orcs are therefore useful idiots in any story where you want to have an army of monsters that you don't have to think about.
Yeah, there's also
that's been how they were for a very long time. Oddly enough, until the 1970s and 80s.
And now the interesting thing, I want to go a little bit further back too, because there are other depictions of what are essentially orcs without the name of them, but are often like orc adjacent that share that same thing. They're usually a name given to something that is just viewed as evil, morally corrupt, or questionable in some like malicious way. Like if you go back to some of the original accountings of the Mongolian hordes, and you look at some of the descriptions from the people that they invaded, they describe them much in the same way of this sort of like orcish appearance, this orcish presentation, right? This is where you get that idea of like the Mongol hordes. And the reason I bring that up is because when you get to Tolkien, which again is sort of like the birthplace of a lot of fantasy aspect for almost everything that comes after it and sort of the blueprint, go back to Peter Jackson's The Hobbit and look at what they describe as orcs and look at how varied they look there. That's from the books. The books describe them in various different forms of physical appearance in the same universe, almost applying to the term that orc wasn't necessarily a race, but something that was just, these are the miscreants, cast-offs, and the malicious, like, dregs of whatever civilization there was. Like, these were potentially, like I said earlier, like, all these things could be true, that these are elves that went wild, or these are elves that decided to mate with beasts, and these are the beast men. These are, you know, maybe things that mutated over time, or were born of magic, or born of slime magic, born of nature gone wrong, or Morgoth, or the you know, sit there and actually created these things. All of these things can be true, and all of these things are very well may be true. The interesting thing, I think, afterwards is how everything that came after Tolkien, sort of, like Eric said that Tolkien was like the filter. Here, it was not necessarily that he was the filter. He's sort of like the font of which everything is then later filtered and distilled down, because orcs, as represented across all media, is so wildly different, right? Like, we can talk about D&D and their evolution of how they were in just D&D, where they went from being these evil beings of just like this, you know, they're going to eat you. That's what they're going to do. That's what they do. They beat up goblins and they run things. They're the big nasty. That's what you're going to go fight. You're going to go kill orcs and you're going to go kill goblins. To being a player race now, where people want to play as them because they're not necessarily just, you know, evil. And their description of being big and powerful and having skin various shades of like green hue, that has now gone away to being various different builds. Like, they're just humans. They're humanoids with a different sort of origin story in D&D. They come from different aspects.
I feel like you and I have been talking for a while, so I'm going to poke Eric and see if he has anything he wants to say.
Yeah, I mean, I read the Silmarillion when I picked it up when I was like 15, expecting, another prequel to Lord of the Rings. I'll get some more information. Maybe it'll give me more about like the orcs and stuff like that. And it really reads more like notes and filling in, like you said, it's all references and like a lot of, like, you know, you read the Lord of the Rings and there's like 3 pages of a song, and the Silmarillion is a lot more like that than, you know, anything action. The fall of Gondolin isn't even like described anywhere. It's just referenced throughout.
Yeah, it's a bunch of times this happened. Anyway, here's 2,500 words about this word that I like.
And like, it wasn't 2025. He didn't have subreddits knocking on his door being like, hey, give us more details, fill this in, you have to clarify this. So now we're at the point where, you know, where other people have picked it up and they're building on it and they're doing other things with it, with the series that are coming out and things like that. But it's interesting, the things that he came up with and moved forward, the things that he filtered through him. And we have orcs in World of Warcraft and they're literal aliens. And so they didn't come from anywhere. And they started as more of the evil, like, oh, they're the invading horde. They're like the bad guys. You can play as them at first.
But really, they're the gnomes of Draenor.
Yeah. And we find out that they didn't even get their green skin from, that's not how they naturally were. They started out as more of a, you know, peaceful.
Olivey brown.
Yeah. So they had that done to them almost. So it's another interesting, like, you started, but then even within one media, you don't have a paragraph about orcs that tells you here's what they are, and then you carry that forward. I mean, I guess you kind of have to have enough of a series or a show or a video game to evolve the race. But with 30 years of Warcraft, they've gone from one thing to something else completely different. And yeah, people do want to play orcs. Who wouldn't want to roll a giant big green skin dude?
Bruce Banner. But one of the things I wanted to mention quickly too is, like, we've talked about it, like, as in something Tolkien invented, and how there's plenty of things he drew from. This goes to the point. One of the things I wanted to mention is in Norse mythology, there's the concept of the Coirned, who are not Norse, sorry, Gaelic, This is basically British. It's mostly England and Ireland, and mostly really it's the places in England that used to be like parts of Wales when Wales was the whole country essentially. And the Koranyid are just like, they're the kind of things where they're constantly being beaten by riddles and weird ideas. It's very similar to Fenris, where, in order to beat them, they have to make a rope out of fish's breath and, the songs of midwives and so forth. It's that kind of thing. And it ties back into why the orcs, ultimately they exist to be fought. It's kind of like the old saying about dragons. Dragons don't exist, to be beaten. They exist to be fought. The myths are not there to show us killing them. It's to show that we can stand up against them, sort of thing. And orcs are fantastic for that. But then as time passed, humans have this really weird ability to kind of
adopt the worst thing.
Well, refuse to be empathetic 1 second and then suddenly be completely drowned by it the next. Like, humans can look at orcs and they're horrible, evil monsters and they must be destroyed. And there's some humans like, but really, I mean, they're not that different from us. What, couldn't we talk to them? Maybe we could work this out. And we even do that in our fiction. And it's kind of, to a certain degree, I actually like where orcs have gotten to. And it is fair to give World of Warcraft some credit for it. Because in the 90s, when Blizzard decided to make its orcs, like the other really popular understanding of orcs, I feel has to be mentioned here, is the Games Workshop version.
Yeah.
Where they're fungus.
Well,
and I'm going to make Joe talk. Because
it depends on what version. So there's 40K and fantasy, which are two completely different things. So we can talk about the Warhammer 40K interpretation, which is, in my opinion, a very, I don't want to say it's a unique version because it definitely draws on some of the influences we talked about. But Matt's right. In Warhammer 40K, they are fungus. Their entire culture is based off of this generation via spore. And this is not to say that they are not a living, like, breathing, evolving race, because they are, but they don't breed. They simply exist. And their origin is actually rooted as a creation of essentially the Warhammer equivalent of the first ones, the Slann. These are supposed to be in fantasy, they used to be a race of fish people, frog people. Sorry for those of you out there that know what that is. And then they turned into a subset of race of like magic users. But in 40K, they were ones that were essentially ordering the universe and were among the first great races to exist in the universe and wanted to fight against what was called the Great Devourer. This may sound familiar to you if you've played World of Warcraft at all recently in the last 5 years. They developed a race of essentially giant super beings that were super intelligent, super hardy, and were supposed to be almost impossible to be destroyed. And they eventually, over the course of eons of war, decades of war, millennia of war, before the universe that we know it in the 30K universe where man goes through the stars, before that happens, they eventually die and are spread apart and reborn, and die and spread apart and reborn, and die and spread apart and reborn, until eventually they turn into the orcs we know. When an orc dies in 40K, their body releases all these spores basically across the planet, where they will lay in dormant gestation for X number of years. It could be 10 years, it could be a decade, it could be millennia. Eventually, orcs are born, and they start out as sort of what they call savage orcs. Orcs' intelligence in 40K is also based on their collective and size, which I think is really fascinating. The more orcs you have, the smarter they get. And part of that is explained through genetic memory that is coded into them. Different flavors of them, whether they're weird boys, ones that are capable of using magic, or mech boys that understand mechanics, or doctors, and I'm using that term loosely, who understand how to apply cybernetics. These are all genetic specializations that unlock in their core memories and their genetic memories as there are more orcs to support it. And their magic and their ability to manipulate reality is based off of how many there are. Orcs are a very strong psychic race in 40K, in which if they believe something strong enough and have enough of the what they call wog juice behind them, which is basically just a bunch of boys or enough of them that believe this, it becomes true. Such as red things go faster, purple things are sneakier, yellow things are luckier, like things like that. This also extends to what they do as far as like their daily lives, where this vehicle, it works, but it works because the 5-year-old who built it, otherwise known as the 40K orc, believes it works. In the books, one of my favorite things that they ever did was during the 90s, there's a section in the Imperialis Codex where they talk about trying to take a bunch of orc technology from a battle that they had and try to reverse engineer it, because that's what humans do. That's what the Imperium does. And as they would open up the engine bays of these vehicles, they'd find a rock with an engine painted on it. And 20 minutes earlier, this thing was driving across the battlefield, no problem. Or they would open up a gun that had been firing with endless ammo and just find a stick with boom written on it. And it's because the orcs believed that this was what was happening. Their collective psychic power made it manifest. And the last thing I think that is really interesting about them, and I've gushed about this for a while, as they get older, they get bigger. As they get bigger, they get more powerful, to the point where they view the largest as their leader naturally, and that largest leader has the ability to do things that others can't, such as move through time, fight themselves, fight gods. And this is all canonical. This is all stuff that has absolutely happened. They're really, really fun. Like if you ever get a chance to read about Gazgul Mog Thraka, go for it. Gazgul is probably one of the largest, oldest, biggest ones who actually went through space and time to kill himself and start a massive wog, because he is the chosen of Mork and or Orc, Gork, and he likes himself a good fight. But yeah, it's an interesting interpretation, and I don't know anywhere else that has viewed orcs as such a unique thing than Warhammer 40K. They're just fighting.
I will
boys.
point out that according to various wikis I've just been on, including the Sigmar one, technically speaking, all greenskins in fantasy reproduce via fungal spores.
Mm.
So they're all essentially 40K orcs.
Well,
they're just 40,000 years earlier and less matured as a race.
Well, that gets a little complicated, because technically that depends on whether it's old world, new world, or the world that revolves, the diversion split from the old world, which is what Blood Bowl is based on, where there are female orcs, because they evolve into that way, and they do not reproduce by spores. They reproduce traditionally.
Which you could still say is technically a kind of spore reproduction. One has a half spore inside, and the other one puts some spores in there.
Sure.
But regardless, it is one of the fascinating things about orcs is that as we went through that period of time, from Tolkien on, and like there's characters like one of my favorite fantasy authors is James Branch Cabell, who wrote a book called Jurgen, which is just utter nonsense. It is almost unreadable by modern readers, because it doesn't have anything approaching a narrative. It's more like Alice in Wonderland or the Oz books than it is, the stuff we have nowadays for fantasy. But one of the things it has the monster people. And another one comes to mind is Lloyd Alexander, his Iron Ring stuff, where they have just this, these bleak spirits that are, trying to kill everybody. They're not really depicted as anything. So there are a lot of these things in stories, but the thing Tolkien did by making them codified the way he did is he gave people carte blanche to just use that. And it's kind of funny that orcs are literally everywhere now. Like you can find them in so many different fantasy things. Like there's so many different D&D-esque worlds where they have orcs on them. of like Eberron, where it's orcs that are like all druids and nature spirits. There's just a ton of this kind of stuff, and it's wild to me to see it because it does really all come from his initial conception in a way that other stuff doesn't.
Now, when we have things like this, where you have stories like new media that comes out, and the orcs are the pretty classic Tolkien orcs, and then there's other stuff like Warhammer, where it's actually so far out that you can barely even attach the word orc to it anymore. Like, you wouldn't recognize it. Like, you could give that whole description to me, and if I didn't know you were talking about orcs, I would have to guess like a couple things before I was like, oh, orcs. Oh yeah, that makes sense. It's like a spectrum of how far you can go. What do you two prefer when you're watching something new or playing something new? Do you like it when something kind of hits all the tropes and uses them cleverly, or do you like it when it turns it on its head or goes really far, or does it matter?
It really depends on the work. I'm going to let Joe go, but that's my initial response.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the context for me. Both is fine. Like, I don't mind fantasy tropes when they're used properly or make sense, or whatever the case is. But I'm always fascinated by games or media that attempts to reinterpret the tropes or give a new sort of rebirth to an old classic. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit in part 2, because I have an idea of where I want to go with this, and I think you'll both enjoy the journey. But I like when people are capable of sitting back and taking a look at it and saying, okay, well, this is how dwarves have been depicted in everything I've read. Now they're going to be something completely different, and this is the way that I view them, and we're going to go forth there, and that's going to be the end of that. As long as it's done well, right? Like, as long as it's well thought out and given the proper time to sort of gestate and like be like its own thing, then yes, I enjoy when people do that. Otherwise, sometimes hitting the classics, there's nothing wrong with that. Although I do think it is really funny when people started losing their minds in the last Thor movie, or not, sorry, not the last Thor movie, the last Avengers movie, where Thor got his new axe made, and they were like, this is a dwarf, he's huge. And it's like, yeah, dwarf can mean a lot of things. It all depends on what you want to talk about, or where you want to go with that origin. So, Matt?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, if a story can basically highlight and take just enough that you know what that thing is supposed to be, but then it completely subverts it, I'm kind of down. I think that's fun. You mentioned God of War earlier, and one of the things I really love is Brock and Etri in the God of War games, especially in Ragnarok. Whereas, like, Brock is for all that Brock has a lot of the classic dwarf stereotype attitudes, but doesn't have a beard. He's kind of blue, and he's less a taciturn dwarf and more, hey, I see through your crap. And I love Brock. I think he's a great character, but Etri is horrifyingly tragic. And it's painful, especially in the second game, to see the journey that Etri is on. And they're dwarf enough that you know what they are. Like, there's never any point where you go, what are those two? They're weird. You know what they are, but they're like, they're kind of like, of all the weird places to get this from, one of my favorite lines is on this kind of concept is from Mass Effect 2, from Morden, where he talks about, it's down to genetic code. All races have geniuses and idiots, but with humans, variability is so great, you can't know what you're dealing with until you experience them. Whereas with other people, you can look at them and make a reasonable guess. And I like it when you can't make a reasonable guess. I like it when you actually have to experience them to understand. I've been playing Wilder Myth recently, which doesn't really have anything like that. And it's kind of jarring to do a game where there's just humans. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we need other peoples just to make it more interesting. We even talked about like some of the really weird ones. But yeah, we should probably talk about goblins too at some point. Like, we're probably much running up on the next episode, right?
Yeah, so I think this is where we're going to call it for this one in particular before we get into part 2. So I'm going to go ahead and do my spiel here because Blizzard Watch is made possible due to your generous contributions at patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means that this podcast setting community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like early access to our podcast, a better chance at having your question answered on our podcast or the queue, and an ads-free site experience. Again, if you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those in to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for in the subject line, as well as any special pronunciation of your name. If you want to hit us up on Discord, we have the Q and Podcast Questions channel, which is set aside for all of our wonderful community there. You can do the same thing, same rules apply. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you have the Patreon Q and Podcast Questions channel, where we tend to look there first. Is Bowie is saying thank you. You're helping us keep the lights on. We want to put you in the front of the queue. And then if you want to, and you don't want to hit us up on Discord, and you don't want to send us an email, you can hit us up on Patreon, and we will get the message. We will group them as appropriate and make sure that we get through them as we can. But that, folks, we'll catch you on the next one.